Welcome back to Media7, where we're discussing the rights and wrongs of political untruths. And what is a lie anyway? I'm joined now by broadcaster turned media consultant Brian Edwards, ministerial speechwriter turned commentator David Slack, and broadcaster Sean Plunkett, who never did take that PR job. Welcome to you all, gentlemen. Brian, I have to say, when we were thinking around the ideas for this show, a lot of what we came up with was effectively broken promises. Do you think it's a lie to merely break a promise because circumstances change?
I think one of the reasons why people think that politicians aren't honest and tell lies all the time has to do with the idea that you have to be consistent all the time, and that's an idea which tends to be pervaded by the media, for one thing. So a lot of the interviews that Sean would do, for example, would be saying to the politician he's interviewing, you're not consistent, you said this last year, now you're saying this. But the reality, of course, is that circumstances change, and politicians have to do that. In my experience, quite different from pretty well everything you've shown so far, is that politicians, in New Zealand at least, generally speaking, are quite honest and do not lie and do not make things up.
Well, I'm pleased to hear that.
They do change their positions a lot, Brian.
They change the positions, but they often change the positions out of necessity. I mean, at the moment, the National Party is changing its position on the amount of money we've got. The Labour Party, if it gets in, will have to change its position as well. So I think it's not really acceptable to say that people always have to be saying the same thing, regardless of what's happening in the world around them. And
I have to say, David Slack, you're an internet guy. This has become such an easy gotcha now in the age of Google, hasn't it? I do it all the time in my blog. Ha ha! You say that now, but you said that 3 years ago.
Yeah, that's dead right. And look, there's one thing to bear in mind. We're talking about a lie like it's a bad thing. But a lie is the lies are the ball bearings that make this machine go around. The difficulty is where people use them inappropriately. Sorry, and I hate. I'm sorry to use that.
The white lie versus the black lie.
Inappropriate lie.
You know, a diplomat that will tell you that the consequence of not ever using a lie is wars, and so what you have is something behind, something less than that. But it's all the question of degree. You know, is this gotcha that you see on the internet, does this really matter or not? Because often the gotcha is simply a device for saying, ha, I don't like you, and now I've got another reason to hate you. And there was an awful lot of that in the last regime, because I think there were a lot of people who really hated Ellen Clark and who were looking for any reason to deplore her.
Brian, I mean, you advised Helen Clark.
Yeah.
It did seem that one thing very early on, Paintergate, actually did her damage through the rest of her political career. And it was such a minor thing. She signed a painting for charity. I
think in many ways that politicians act like children. You know, when you were a kid and you were suddenly found out in something, the first thing you always did as a child was to deny it. You said, I did not do that, you know, and you insisted you didn't do it. And sometimes you get a bit legalistic about it, you see. So when your mother said, did you eat all the chocolate biscuits? You would say, no, I didn't eat all the chocolate biscuits, because in fact you gave 2 of the chocolate biscuits to Toby the dog. So really it was true, you had not eaten all the chocolate biscuits. And this, of course, is the same foundation as I did not have sex with that woman. It's exactly the same thing, the same sort of legalistic defence. But I think they panic, and you mentioned in your clip David Benson Pope.
But Brian, he wasn't fired for that. He was fired for the Madeleine Setchell affair, when he denied that he had intervened to prevent her getting a job in his office. And I, in fact, had conducted the interview where, in a very tiny way, he showed the lie. He said, when we found out about it, and he had until that time said he'd had no idea she had applied for the job. It was just that. And I said, hang on. You said you didn't know about this. Now you're talking about when we found out about it. And he said, I was using the royal we. Well, that was it. And that was the lie that got him fired, not the tennis ball in the mouth.
But we're not in disagreement here, because that was also what you might call a retrospective lie. So he's lying about something that's come up that happened in the past. My experience is that politicians in New Zealand don't generally lie about what is going to happen. They may lie about something that's already happened.
Yeah. Sean, you have had a reputation as an aggressive interviewer. Have you ever... I can't recall you actually using the word very often, though.
Lie?
Yeah, lie.
No, because all I'm doing is asking the question.
Yeah,
and it's largely to the audience to interpret that response as to whether or not it is consistent with previous positions, and whether or not, to be honest, that matters to them. That's entirely up to them, and it's the job of the interviewer and the journalist to keep looking for the question that can't be avoided, Brian, or can't be flim-flammed and say, you know, Scruffy the dog had 2 of the biscuits, therefore I didn't eat all of them. That's what the interviewer should be looking for, the definitive question that gets the answer. Now, whether or not the answer is a lie that the viewer or the listener cares about is entirely up to them.
But sometimes the answer can't be given, and that is then interpreted as being shifty or dishonest.
Why can't the answer be given, Brian?
Well, I watched an interview with Guy Espiner the other day. He was interviewing the leader of the Labour Party, Phil Goff. And Phil Goff is, within 2 hours, going to make his big speech at the Congress. And Guyer is asking him to tell him what is in the speech. Now, that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous to ask him to do that because he can't do it. So he says, well, I can't answer that. I can't answer that.
Well, that's not a lie.
Then he moves on. No, but then he moves on to ask him what policies are going to be around before the election. He can't answer that either. Yeah. But the net result of all of that is that after half an hour of this going on, the viewer thinks, this guy, Goff, won't answer anything.
Well, the truth is this guy, Goff, should have had someone like you advising him not to do the interview if he didn't have anything to say.
Ah, well, that's another matter.
Yeah.
Actually, David Slack, let's talk about the guy who actually is Prime Minister. John Key on the BBC Hard Talk interview, which we discussed recently on the show. I thought practised a particularly interesting form of denial in that he greeted factual propositions unerringly as mere points of view. Do you think he was trained into that? Because it was oddly effective.
I'm not sure what training he's been getting, but there is a certain nature to him that you can discern, and you can track it all the way back to that unfortunate interview he had with who was the Nelson DJ, who said to him before, when he was candidate Key, where did you stand on the Springbok tour? And there was the longest pregnant pause in a political interview you've ever heard before he declared that he couldn't remember. Which is a finessing of what they all say in the white collar criminal cases. I have no recollection. But it's the same thing. And you see in his more recent efforts deflection, mostly. He seems to be pretty good at deflection, and he was using it there. And I think, actually, it's not so much training as the money market trader instinct of finding a way to deflect when he's doing that kind of thing.
But there's a very interesting thing here, and that is if you wanted to count the number of examples you can find in New Zealand of outright lies by politicians, it's quite small, actually. I don't think you'll find very many.
I'd agree.
And it may have something to do with the fact we're a small society. It's probably harder to get away with a lie when there are 4 million of us than if there are 100 million
I was thinking back of probably the biggest porky I've ever been told, and it was before the 2005 election. I asked Helen Clark where the $900,000 from the pledge card came from, and she said, normal and usual sources. And I thought back and thought, really, that was just a complete and utter porky, wasn't it?
But you see the panic there as well with the painting affair. I mean, that's exactly the same thing that happened there. Suddenly this thing comes out. It really wasn't a big deal, you know. I mean, a Prime Minister will be signing things all the time, but nonetheless, what was said wasn't true. And you have this panic. And Helen, interestingly enough, was someone who was brought up in a family where nobody ever told a lie, nobody ever made a mistake. And so I think you see that panic then coming out, and then everything goes berserk, and suddenly you have somebody taking the picture and burning the thing on a barbecue somewhere.
Yeah, and now that's a good example of something that you see quite a lot, especially with the heavy hitters like Clinton or Blair, where these people, the essence of them is that you sense that the lie they would tell to you is the same lie they will tell, in Tony Blair's case, to Cherie. You know, he believes it so much, or he's prepared to say it in every circumstance.
So the important thing for us is basically that they say the same thing in private and in public.
Right. It's the
regardless of the fact that it's not true.
You want to believe in your hero, and as long as they seem to be consistent about it, you're fine. And to pick up on the initial question you asked about Key, I think you see it at work with him at its most deft, I suspect, where he's hosing people down. And I think this is where that smiling assassin thing comes from. You know, he begins with saying, the ship has sunk, but we're confident we can get the rescue boats out and not a person will drown. And then a little time goes by and he says, we're sorry we couldn't get any of the rescue boats off the beach, but we think we'll still get quite a few people. And finally he says, it's a real shame they all drowned. But, you know, he's very good at hosing it down, and I think that's why they called him the smiling assassin, because you ended up without your job at Merrill Lynch, but you didn't... Was it Merrill Lynch?
Yeah.
But you didn't quite know how it happened.
Sean, one thing we see a lot of from political journalists these days is them calling the race. They seem to fancy themselves as strategists. I wonder whether there's a conflict between journalists insisting on finding the truth and then castigating politicians for not saying what the public wants to hear. Yeah. The two are really the same thing.
I mean, most journalists wouldn't know the truth if they fell over it. That's why we're always asking questions to find out what the current version of the truth is. And I go back to Graham Greene in The Quiet American. It's a lovely book. He says, what is the truth? Well, no one knows except God and perhaps columnists.
We only met Joe Mencken.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm a columnist.
Well, and so am I, but I wouldn't presume. We are constantly, particularly in daily media, looking for the current version of the truth. And of course, as facts and circumstances unfold, that does change, and politicians tend to change with that information.
Are there lies they have to tell? I'm thinking of, we're going to catch up with Australia. Wage rates.
Yes. Well, it is the same as the lie we have at present, and that is that New Zealand SAS troops aren't handing people over to Afghanistan security forces who are torturing them. Now, they clearly are, and they're involved in operations that are clearly doing that. Yet we have a carefully constructed and systemic way of sustaining that lie so no one has to admit the truth.
Can I just add one thing to that, and that is that in New Zealand we have a very media-savvy population, and it's very difficult to get away with lies in New Zealand. New Zealanders understand what happens in people's faces when they're on television. They understand the sort of tone that people are using when they speak. Our three sort of guidelines for people we train are: be straightforward, tell the truth and admit your mistakes. You can do that with the politicians for the first two. Admit your mistakes, forget it. They won't do it. And sometimes that takes them into areas that are very close to lying.
And if you're going to tell the truth, try and tell the most palatable version.
Right.
Thank you very much.
That's right.
And that's our show. Thanks again to Dr. Martin Jay, Dr. Brian Edwards, David Slack and Sean Plunkett, and of course to you for watching. We'll be back with Media7 at the same time next week. Until then, goodbye.